On this episode of Skeptico, near-death experience researcher Dr. Jeffrey Long reacts to Dr. Sam Parnia's Skeptico interview.
I certainly strongly support anybody to have any reasonable opinion about near-death experiences. I think the one opinion that I think is not reasonable at this point in time is the absolute blanket statement that NDEs are illusions. There's just too strong evidence that's been forthcoming from my research as well as the research of others. I mean, by the time you have near-death experiencers with crystal clear consciousness, the out-of-body observations seem to overwhelmingly be correct in both prospective and retrospective studies. Near-death experiences and those totally blind from birth, typical near-death experiences, even while under general anesthesia, and it goes on and on. I think given the strength of that evidence, I would take strong issue with someone that was an opinion that said NDEs are definitely an illusion. I think that's really pretty thoroughly refuted. However, if people are uncertain about whether, near-death experiences are an illusion or not, in other words, they're open to the possibility that NDEs are real, I think that is a reasonable position, and I see Sam Parnia's beliefs as being in that area of being a reasonable opinion.
Stay with us for Skeptico.
Welcome to Skeptico, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on this episode of Skeptico, well, I have a couple of different things I want to try and mishmash together and create a show for you. But before I do any of that, I want to take a minute, because I really don't talk about this too much, but I wanted to just thank you all, listeners. It's kind of amazing. You sit down here in front of a microphone in your office all by yourself after the kids are going to school, and it's nice and quiet, and you talk, and maybe you call some people up and you talk to them, and it's just amazing that can reach out and connect with so many people like this show has. And that interaction, that talking to you and you talking back to me, has really been a tremendous gift, at the risk of being trite. But it really has. It's been a tremendous experience for me. And I just want to say thanks. And I hope that I can continue to do this for a long time. And I hope that you'll stay with me and be a part of this and invite other people to join this thing that we have going on here at Skeptico. Okay, enough getting that out of the way. Here's what I wanted to bring to you today. In the last episode of Skeptico, I laid out this idea that the Skeptico show has been going down these two tracks. There's one track of exploring what's real, and the other track of exploring what that means for us. In particular, what does that mean about the deep life issues? Who are we? Where are we going? What are really spiritual issues, but we don't like to say they're spiritual issues because that kind of freaks some people out. And I want to go down both those tracks today, but in kind of an unusual way a little bit. Because after I said that in the last show, I realized that what really is interesting to me, and I think to so many listeners out there, is how much these tracks intersect and overlap. It's like in the railroad tracks where they cross over and they have the crossing stations and all that stuff. And that's constantly going on here, because this process of understanding what's real isn't a fixed event, right? It's something that's constantly going on, right? We're constantly filtering in new information, hearing different opinions, sorting, sifting, and saying, okay, this seems like the best bet of what's real, what's consensus reality at this point. And then we move on and get some new information, and then we take that in really deeply sometimes, and we say, oh, okay, so this is what this means for me. This is who I am. And then that changes our filter in terms of what we get in the next round of what's real. So in the spirit of this being an iterative process that never ends, and you never know when that new information is going to come in and kind of shift your world a little bit, I ran across a rather amazing video. And here's a little bit of audio from it.
Stanford Research Institute has been conducting an experimental program in the field of psychoenergetic effects. This film describes a 5-week investigation conducted at Stanford Research Institute with Uri Geller, a young Israeli. The film portrays experiments that we performed with him just as they were carried out. Each scene has been taken from film footage made during actual experiments. Nothing has been restaged or specially created.
Okay, now I know a lot of you are probably familiar with this story, but for those of you who are not, there are these two researchers, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who are PhDs at Stanford, double E types, and they're just kind of chugging along doing their research, and they get a knock at the door from the CIA. This is in the 1960s, and the CIA has heard that the Russians are looking into psychic spying, and they figure they better get into this too, and they hire these guys and set them up through Stanford Research Institute to begin a series of experiments on psychic phenomena. And that becomes this big project called Stargate, and we've had Paul Smith on to talk about remote viewing, and we've touched on it in a couple other episodes. But this video focuses on the ESP, if you will, which was the term of the day, work that they did with Uri Geller. And Uri Geller is become quite a showman and quite famous mentalist. But what's so amazing about this video is it really is just a straight, simple series of ESP experiments. Let me play a little bit more audio, and then I'm going to pop in here again.
This is Uri Geller. With Uri Geller, this is Edgar Mitchell, who, with his eyes covered, is trying to pick up the number that Geller is sending. Also, we see Wilbur Franklin of Kent State, Harold Puthoff, and Russell Targ of SRI, along with Don Schuick, Vice President for Research at SRI.
Now, I've provided a link to this video in the show notes, so you can go watch it for yourself. But I want to play these clips because you can get a pretty good sense for what's going on here. For instance, here the camera is just panning by these guys sitting on a couch one by one, and it's kind of an interesting mix of people. They look a lot younger than they do nowadays because it's 40 plus years ago. And there's also Edgar Mitchell there, who's a famous astronaut who goes on to found the IONS Institute that, of course, Dean Radin is a researcher at and has been so prominent in doing a lot of psi research. So it's just kind of interesting, but let's get back to playing some more clips from this because it gets even more interesting.
Here we present a case of a double-blind experiment in which someone not associated with the project comes into the experimental room, places an object into a can chosen at random from 10 aluminum cans.
Okay, so I think this is pretty simple, but let me explain it for you. There's 10 cans, kind of like the old film, 35 millimeter film cans, you know, these tiny little cans. And in one of the cans is a ball, a metal ball, and it's randomized so nobody knows before they go in the room. They go in the room, Uri Geller is asked, where's the ball? And he finds the ball. Here are the results.
We repeated this type of experiment 14 times. 2 additional trials were made, one with a paper-wrapped ball bearing and one with a sugar cube. The latter 2 targets were not located. Geller felt that he didn't have adequate confidence as to where they were, and he declined to guess and passed. On the other 12 targets, the ball bearing, the magnet, and the water, he did make a guess as to the target location and was correct in every instance.
So they run this experiment 14 times. 2 of the times Geller passes. He says, I don't know, I'm not going to pick on this one. Now for the other 12 trials, pick which can out of 10 has the ball. He gets every one right. Every single one of the 12 trials, 1 ball out of 10 in the can, he gets them all right.
The whole array of this run had an a priori probability of 1 part in 10 to the 12th, or statistics of 1 trillion to 1.
Did you catch that? Odds against chance, 1 trillion to 1. Guess 1 out of 10, 12 times in a row. No misses. That's just astounding. And if you're worried about Geller pulling some tricks or anything like that, I mean, come on, this is a simple experiment. He's in another room. They send their secretary in to mix up the cans, label them, and put a ball in there. I mean, it's not like there's some trick involved. But if you don't like that experiment, check out this next one. This is even more interesting in a way to me. So they take a box, a little steel box, you know, the kind that they used to put index cards in back in the olden days, you know. So they take this box and they put a die in it, you know, a dice you roll playing backgammon or whatever. They put it in there, they close it up. You obviously can't see. It's sealed, right? And now it's double-blinded. No one can see. They take the box, they shake it, and the die lands. And they ask Uri Geller to guess what the number is. And then after he guesses, they open up and see what the number is, right? I mean, you can't get a more controlled experiment than that. I mean, how can you fake it? No one knows. You're shaking the dice inside of a box and you open up to look at it. Here are the results.
We decided at the outset to carry out the die-and-box experiment until we got to 1,000,000 to 1 odds, at which time the experiment was terminated. Out of 10 tries in which he passed twice and guessed 8 times, the 8 guesses were correct, and that gave us a probability of about 1 in 1,000,000. We would point out again there were no errors in the times he made a guess.
So the film goes on, there's many more experiments, and they're all presented in this very kind of dry, matter-of-fact, 60s educational film kind of way, which is nostalgic and interesting in a way. But then it winds up with this. And I have to say, this, when I was watching it, this is the clip that made me say, I got to put this on Skeptico.
What we've demonstrated here are the experiments that we performed in the laboratory and should not be interpreted as proof of psychic functioning.
So there's so many different parts of this that are interesting, but what really piqued my interest is this idea that this isn't proof. And that word just jumped out at me, proof. You know, proof is a term that gets thrown around a lot, especially in Skeptico when we hash it out and what is that really proof? And then somebody challenges and says, well, science can never prove anything. We can only have theories and, all that. But, let's just get real in the way that we normally think about it. If I told you that a guy guessed the roll of a dice 8 times in a row, and I said, that proves to me that he has some kind of ESP ability, most people would go, yeah, that sounds like pretty good proof. And especially if I added that, he also picked a ball out of 10 cans and he did that 10 times in a row. I'd say, hey, that's pretty good proof. That proves it to me. And most of us would say, yeah, that proves it to me. Now, as I said before, I'm open to new information. If I find out something different, I can change my mind. But until then, most of us would say, hey, it sounds like proof. And I guess what I'm driving at is, can we loosen up all the heavy-duty doubter skeptic stuff and just acknowledge that there's some things out there that, unless they really contradicted with these cherished beliefs we have about how the world is supposed to work, we'd look at and say, that's pretty good proof that the world works a little differently than I thought. The second part, or the second level that you can look at this, is you look at Uri Geller. What does this say about Uri Geller? Now, Uri Geller has been maligned and exposed and talked about in terms of, is he a showman or a fraud or a fake? Well, I don't know. I mean, you can look at each case, but I can certainly go back and look at this video and look at these men who tested them, who certainly are competent enough to do these simple, basic, third-grade science project kind of tests and say, something was going on. This guy has some kind of ability, or at least he did at some point. And then that calls into question the whole social movement of skepticism and what it means and knocking people down and all that stuff, which I think also plays so prominently into the issues that we've been talking about here. And it certainly plays prominently into the interview that I had a couple episodes back with NDE researcher Sam Parnia. On today's show, what I want to do is play for you an interview that I did as a follow-up to the Parnia interview with Dr. Jeff Long. Dr. Jeff Long, of course, is one of the world's leading near-death experience researchers. And when we had Dr. Parnia on and say that he suspects that NDEs are an illusion, a trick of the mind, that really kind of got my ire, because I don't know how you come up with that conclusion if you've looked at any NDE research at all. And I felt the need to reach out to some other NDE researchers and get their opinion on that. And I have several. And you're going to hear from Jeff Long today. And then the next episode, I have Dr. Pin van Lommel, another one of the world's leading NDE researchers. And he has a couple of comments on it as well. But the context that I wanted to put this in, the framing, if you will, relate back to a couple of points that we just talked about. One is, what's proof? Sam Parnia seems to have this level of proof that seems to me to be extraordinary. And not extraordinary in a good way. Extraordinary in a way that really defies common sense. Extraordinary because it dismisses data that we would normally look at, like in those Uri Geller experiments, and say, wow, that looks like pretty good proof to me. But in the case of Dr. Parnia, what we have is